Well, good morning, Lehigh Acres. It is such a huge blessing to be here with you. Your hospitality is second to none. I've felt spoiled from the moment I met the search committee team until us getting here on Thursday and this whole weekend that we've been here. Y'all are incredible, and thank you for that. And man, I think there's some really awesome stuff that's going to happen in this church and in this community because of what God's doing right here. So thank you. So today we are going to take a look at chapter 15 in the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. If you have your Bible with you, or if you have one of them smart gadgets and you have the Bible app on there, turn with me, if you would, to Luke chapter 15. And what we find in Luke chapter 15 is Jesus' lost and found. Yeah, did you ever realize there was a lost and found in the Bible? I mean, I guess really when you think about it, the whole Bible is about lost and found. But there's this one section, this one chapter dedicated to the lost and found. And the lost and found is a really interesting thing. If you've ever explored your local lost and found, you always find some really rather obscure things in there. And to prove my point, I brought the lost and found from Real Life Christian Church. So I guess you could say the lost and found is lost and found for anybody that may be looking for it. Yeah, that was a cheesy pastor joke, right? That's good stuff. So I know y'all really want to know what's in here, right? Yes, you do, because it's always a story. It's always an adventure. Okay, this is great. So we are in South Florida. Are there any Dolphins fans here? You don't have to admit it, even if you are, I guess. But Miami Dolphins 2019 playbook. There it is. That explains a whole lot this year, right? If anybody has any contacts on the other side of Miami, you might want to let them know. Unfortunately, there aren't any wins in here for them, but maybe that'll change this weekend. Who knows? Okay, let's see what else is in here. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. Credit card. Yes, that's great. Okay, there's always somebody that's usually quick to jump on that one. But I always find it funny because it seems like credit cards, car keys, wallets are some really obscure things, in my opinion, that end up in the lost and found. Because I wonder, you lost your car keys. Is there somebody wandering around this building, that's been living here indefinitely that we just haven't found yet? And then credit cards are always interesting, too, because it's like, what do you do after church? You go to Culver's, right? And how do you pay for your Culver's? You need your credit card or your debit card or what have you. But, okay, so credit card here. And you know who this belongs to? This is Dave Ramsey's credit card. There you have it. We know that's been lost for a little while. And I wonder if maybe that's what really inspired the whole Financial Peace University thing. It wasn't getting out of debt. It was, I just keep losing my credit card, and I don't know what to do. Okay. All right. One more fun thing in here, too. So, a Bible. And that's pretty typical to find in a church lost and found, because for whatever reason, people come with a Bible and leave without one. Hopefully, they're coming without Jesus and leaving with him, even though they leave their Bible. But so this looks kind of new. Let's see who this might belong to. Okay. You'll love this one. This is a Joel Osteen Bible, right? Yep. So, yeah, there you have it. Lost and found. You never know what you're going to find in the lost and found. I'll just leave that one alone. Y'all can go with that one. Yeah, okay. And it starts already, right? So Luke chapter 15, the lost and found. Jesus is lost and found. And what we find in Luke chapter 15 is this triad of lost things, found things. And Jesus kicks off the chapter, as we find in Luke chapter 15, with the story of the lost sheep. And yeah, we've sung that song before, right? About Jesus leaving the 91, or so, the shepherd leaving the 99 sheep of the flock in pursuit of that one obstinate sheep who just likes to wander off and go astray and do his own thing. And there he leaves the sheep, and then you can see that image of Jesus throwing the sheep over his shoulders and walking back and placing him back in the fold of sheep that he has. And What a great story for our lives, right? We're so thankful that we have a great shepherd like that that'll go after us when we stray. And then Jesus turns his attention to this next parable, which is the parable of the lost coin. And we have this story of this woman who's got these 10 coins, and each coin is equivalent to about a day's wage, and she ends up losing one of the coins. And yeah, I think we'd all be a little frustrated if we lost a day's wage, right? And then, so she just turns her house upside down, looking for this lost coin. And then she finds it after looking what seemed like forever. And then what does she do? She celebrates. And it's really interesting because it's not just her celebrating, but she calls her friends over and she celebrates about finding this lost coin. And I think there's a really cool lesson in there, but we're not going to go that far, so you can chew on it for a little bit. But I wonder, with every celebration, there always comes a cost associated with it as well, too. So did she happen to find that lost coin, that tenth of her savings, and end up giving it back so that she could celebrate with her friends, welcoming them to the party? I don't know, but I think there's something really cool there that maybe we could explore another time. And then Jesus moves on to the story of the lost son, which is where I'd like for us to spend some time today. And Jesus shares this story of this son and his father, and he goes his wayward way, and we've probably heard him called the prodigal son. And so in here we find these stories, these parables, and Jesus likes to really share his lesson through telling stories. And I'd like to share with you a story this morning as well, too, that works pretty well with the story of the lost son. And it's a story of a fellow that I've come to know pretty well in recent years. And oddly enough, there was a time in my life and in our relationship when I would have said we were mortal enemies. And through time and that lifelong bond that we shared, he and I began to unpack his story. And I've really grown blessed to gain a deeper understanding of him and to learn of just what God is able to do when you go from lost to found. And so I have to share a little bit of backstory in order for us to get to the story. So his story really started when he was 8 years old. Now, I know there was some stuff before that, but 8 years old is when the story really began for him. And there was that one moment. And we all have these defining moments, especially in our story when we're venturing into the lost. And for him, the defining moment was when his parents got divorced. And that seems like a pretty common thing that happens today in our culture, and it's widely accepted. And about, 50% of marriages end in divorce. And sometimes we tend to neglect the casualties that accompany when what God brought together, someone has separated. And in this case, one of the casualties was this young 8-year-old boy. His dad was an over-the-road truck driver. His mom was a retail manager. They both lived very full lives. And here you have this boy now kind of caught and left to his own devices. And when things like this happen and when these relational splits happen, it often forms relational voids inside of us. And so we see this longing that emerges. For him, it was a longing to feel accepted, a longing to feel like he belonged in a family, to have that cohesiveness, that balance, that consistency. And so he took some steps to try to find that, fill that longing inside of him. And so often on our path to being lost, our longing transitions into living for something, and so often it's living for all of the wrong things. So for him, there were few things that he had a handle on, and he found one thing that seemed to bring him joy, because on the weekends when his dad was home after being on the road all week, his dad would always spend the day cooking, and he'd have these big dinners, and friends and other family members would come over, and there was laughter and joy and just storytelling, and it was a great time for him. And so he equated food with fulfilling that longing inside of him. And so with that correlation that he found, he just continued to eat even when there wasn't these times of celebration and getting together, and he became a pretty unhealthy young man. Now that leads to other relational issues, because when you become a little unhealthy and you kind of stand out from your peers at school, I mean, kids are mean, right? So he ran into some mean kids at school, and he became the object of their ridicule. And now all of a sudden, this relational void that was inside of him began to deepen. And he didn't understand because he was giving himself to something that he felt would bring him joy and peace and fulfillment. And yet that wasn't working because over here in this arena that he was operating in, there was just strife and trial and hurt and brokenness and ridicule. And so we find that this young boy transitioning through the adolescent and into teen years was really seeking to find himself in something. Put the food behind him. He began playing more sports. He began working out more. And then the teen years happened. And teen years happened for some young males and females. And they begin to look a little different and feel a little different. And then, of course, he's seeking to find himself and to fill that longing inside of him. And that longing inside of him, he transitions from food to friends to maybe a girlfriend will satisfy that. As a young man, a young teen, then he began dating at a very early age and trying to fill that longing inside of him. But he's still trying to do it with all of the wrong things. And with dating, especially as a teen, there's pressures that arise and there's hormones that are raging. And he's longing to fill this relational void that's inside of him. And so he thinks that maybe by diving into and stepping into some really unhealthy activities with these girls that he's dating, that maybe that'll help fill the void, but it doesn't. It just brings further hurt and further doubt and further shame and further longing inside of him. And then all of a sudden, he meets the high school sweetheart, right? We've been there. I don't even know, do they call that high school sweetheart anymore? There's probably some obscure acronym for it, right? Like BFF, or something like that. So he meets his high school sweetheart, and he sees his fulfillment coming through this young lady. But things get complicated, as they so often do, especially when you're a teenager with very little direction and you've got this deep wound inside, this deep longing inside that you're trying to fulfill. And so things got complicated, and these two found out that as 17-year-old kids that they themselves would be having a child. And so things got really challenging between the two, and so they thought maybe the only way to solve this issue that they had was to get in the car and to drive across state lines, and they ended up at an abortion clinic, and there they fixed their problem. Except it didn't fix the problem. It just deepened this wound that was inside of him, and it formed a whole new wound inside of her. It was about this time as well that his sweetheart's family had decided to move across country. Now, it didn't have anything to do with what had just happened because no one had known what had just happened, but they longed to be with their family and in the places where they grew up, and so they brought in this young fella who'd become a bit of an honorary member to their family, and they welcomed him to come along. And I'll tell you what, teenagers' minds are full of really bad ideas, as most of ours probably are as well too. And then when you put another bad idea in their mind, it's just a recipe for disaster. So this fellow was invited between his junior and senior year of high school to move across country with his sweetheart and her family. And the only issue was the one thing his parents longed to watch their son do is to graduate high school, especially his dad. Because you see, his dad and his mom got pregnant when they were in high school, and his dad dropped out of high school when he was a junior in order to care for the child that he and his mom had. So his dad desired nothing more than to watch his son walk across that stage. But there was a longing inside of this young man. Every day he'd come home from school after his sweetheart and her family left, and he would just lay it on thick to his mom. You don't care about me, you don't love me, you don't want what's best for me, because I know what's best for me as teenagers, right? We know what's best for us, right? So I know what's best for me, and I know what I need to go do, and I need to fill this void and this longing inside of me, and the only way for me to do that is to move across country and to be with her, to be with this idol of mine. And every night he would bring his mom to tears, and the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, and so deepening this relational void and this longing inside of this young man. And then one day his dad caught wind of what was going on between the young fella and his mom, and his dad, knowing how irrational some teenagers can be, especially his son, thought he might do something foolish that would ruin the rest of his life and just get in his car and leave one day. And so he made him a deal. He said, I will sign you out of high school here so long as you finished high school out there. Well, it was news to this 17-year-old boy, finally having the opportunity to leave this mess that he was in and go in pursuit of the one thing that was going to fill him up. But he was living for all the wrong things. And so he packed up his things, he got together the few things that he had, and he headed off to a distant land. And this is where we're going to pick up in Luke chapter 15, verse 11. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country. And let's put a pin in that right there. You know, we're not given the backstory of the prodigal son, of the lost son. And I think Jesus does that for a reason. And I think Luke, as he records this parable, does that for a reason. Because he knows we can fill in the blank. Because we have stories just like this young lost fella right here. We know we can put behind it the exclamation point of what that longing inside of us is and was. We know that we can complete this story. He knows that we can complete this story. And so I think there's some really deep purpose as to why we're given very little backstory, and we don't understand what that longing was inside of him or why he wanted to leave home or what he was pursuing. Because we can fill in the blank. Because this is our story. So this young man, he headed off, left home, met with his sweetheart and her family, and then things got complicated again. Because that's really just what happens when you're lost. Things get mighty complicated. Sure enough, soon after he'd moved in, he and his sweetheart found out that they were going to have a child. And they've walked down this path before, and they did learn something from that because they couldn't go back and experience that brokenness and that hurt and that lostness that they felt before, something that they would be unpacking for a lifetime ahead of them. Little did they know at that time. And so this time they decided that they would choose life. Now, you know what happens when a teenage girl confronts her parents and tells them that she's pregnant and they know who the young teenage boy is involved? Not good things. So there was some friction, needless to say, that occurred between our fella and his sweetheart's family. And it all came to a head on graduation night. He made it. He crossed that finish line. And that night, things were said that couldn't be unsaid, and things were done that couldn't be undone. And he was no longer welcome to live with his sweetheart and her family. And you know, this helps us to see that, you know, lost people do a really good job of losing people. And hurt people do a really good job of hurting people. And that's exactly the situation that this fellow was in at this time. And so he was no longer welcome to live there. He was given $50 and he was put on a bus and told that he could go live with his relatives that lived 300 miles away. And you know, this is the same situation that this lost son in Jesus' story gets in as well too. So he set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. And so he went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach, with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. You know what happens when you have that longing inside of you and then you start living for all of the wrong things to try to fill that longing inside of you? It so often leads to this point, which is losing it all. Longing, living for the wrong things, losing it all. That's the same place that this fella was at as well too. He was lost and broken and confused and hurt and had no idea what the next thing was to fill him, but he knew the situation that he was in wasn't the right situation for him. And you know, so often God allows this time of losing it all in order to allow that soil of our heart to become most fertile. And it was at this point in which someone shared with this fella the story of a man named Jesus. They planted the seed, but it was still a little ways from taking root. This is what happened to the lost son. Picking up verse 17. When he came to his senses, now there's a line for you. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out, and I will go back to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven, and I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' And so he got up, and he went to his father." Same thing that our lost fella did here. And then we run into a big but in Scripture. When Scripture's full of big buts, we know big things are happening. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. He's filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. He threw his arms around him and he kissed him. This son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. Put sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he's found." And so they began to celebrate. There comes that moment when we have to swallow our pride, when we're taking the turn back home. We recognize that what we've been doing is not what we should be doing. For this young fella, he fully expected that he would go home and he would hear a very abrupt "I told you so," that he would maybe be cast out from the family that he'd put through so much up to that point, that maybe he just didn't really have a place to belong, but if he just had a place to stay for a short while, he could maybe work on fixing things. When this fella got on a plane and he went back home and he was met by his family, he was met by a mother's love and a father's love who threw their arms around him and met him in his brokenness. You know what happens to people who are lost, who are trying to go from lost to found? The only way to get them there is to show them a little bit of love and grace. This wasn't the end of the story for this fellow, because he was still very broken. He was still very wounded, and the seed had been planted, but it was far from taking root, and he was seeking to fill the next thing. What's the next thing? How can I satisfy this longing inside of me, is what he thought. And so he gave himself to work. Surely that will satisfy, says everybody who's been employed here. Surely my work will satisfy me. He worked and worked and worked, and that's not a bad thing at all for young men, but he worked, and it became fruitless, and it felt like he was working towards nothing as he had early mornings and late nights and little paychecks. So we wondered what the next thing was. When we're lost, we're always looking for the next thing to try to fill the void inside of us, especially when we're living for all of the wrong things. And so we thought, maybe I'll just go down to the recruiting center and I'll sign on the line, and then he went to the processing center and he signed it on that dotted line, and I'll join the greatest brotherhood in the world, the United States military. So he had a ship date that was set for a few months after he went through that process, but then things got complicated, because things get complicated for lost people. He was offered a very lucrative position with a very large company. And oddly enough, his start day was the same day as his ship day. And so he had a big decision to make. Do I fulfill my commitment to where I've signed on the dotted line? Or instead, do I pursue my flesh? Success, potentially. Money, potentially. Well, I don't have to tell you which path he chose because I think you all know at this point. He abandoned his commitment, and he thought maybe if I give myself into making more money, then that'll fill what's inside of me. But God was still working in his life. Despite his failures and his floundering, despite your failures and your floundering, God is still working and moving in your life. Shortly after he abandoned his commitment, he was introduced to a young woman. A young woman who caught his eye much differently than the last time. And it didn't take long for the two, and he asked her to marry him. And yet he wouldn't allow that to come easy either. You see, when we're lost, we tend to try to lose people. And when we're hurt, we tend to hurt people. And Satan, the enemy, will do everything he can to keep us from the love of God. So he began to hear these whispers. You know, Paul warns us in Ephesians, do not give the devil a foothold. And he began to hear these voices saying, what are you doing, man? You're 21 years old. Why are you planning a wedding? Don't you know where all of your friends are tonight? You're so lame. You're such a bad friend. Go hang out with them. You know they're at the bar, right? You know that's a lot more fun than what you're doing right now, right? And man, then the enemy knows, he knows the great lines to tell you. Do you really think your marriage is going to last? Don't you remember what happened to your parents? Do you really think you're any different? Lost people lose people. Hurt people hurt people. So he turned his back on his fiancée and he began having an affair and gave himself to going to the bar and hanging out with his friends instead. And gosh, then things got complicated. Because then he found out that his fiancée was pregnant. Boy, oh boy, don't we know this story already? He'd already lost everything before. And he couldn't handle losing it all again. And so he just threw himself at her mercy. By the grace of God, she forgave him. Things began to heal. Time began to mend them, and they welcomed in their child, and they got married, and they began looking for that something that they've both been looking for in life. And they had some really close friends of theirs who would call them every Friday and Saturday night to come and watch their kids while they went out to the bar. And it was always a promise of, I'll be back by 10, which was 2 a.m. And that happened each and every week, and each and every week they succumbed to that, and then it got to the point where they refused to watch their friends' kids, and the calls stopped, and then all of a sudden they began getting some different calls. They noticed this drastic change in these people that were very close to them. The calls were no longer, will you watch my kids while we go to the bar? They were, hey, why don't you come sit with me at church? We all get to that point where we run out of excuses, and finally they ran out of excuses, and on one June Sunday morning, they ended up at a small rural church, and they sang the songs of worship, and they heard the word of a father's love. For the very first time, that fella felt that wound inside of him begin to shrink just a little bit. All of a sudden, the longing subsided just a little bit. All of a sudden, the living for all of the wrong things came to a realization that these are all the wrong things, that there's something better and something more. And so the late Saturday nights turned into early Saturday nights so we could get up for church the next morning. They got up for church and they would go and they'd hear that word and that void would shrink. And all of a sudden it came to a head one day when he decided to give himself to Jesus. He was baptized. And in that moment, he turned around and he saw the Father running right towards him. And he threw the robe on his shoulders, and he put the ring on his finger, and he put the sandals on his feet. And he made the great proclamation, slaughter the fattened calf, because the son of mine who was dead is alive again. The son of mine who was lost has been found. Let's celebrate. Now, I don't have to tell y'all because you probably figured it out at this point. But this is my story. This is how God has led me from lost to found. To go from lost to found, it takes a little bit of love and grace. That comes from the people around us, but most importantly, it comes from our Father in heaven who has created us to do immeasurably more in life. And I promise you today that if you feel lost, if you've given yourselves to all the wrong things, if you have a longing inside of you, that all you've got to do is turn around. Because the Father's running right for you. He's ready to throw the robe on your shoulders. He's ready to put the ring on your finger. He's ready to put the sandals on your feet. He's ready to slaughter the fattened calf, whatever that means, but it sounds delicious. And he's ready to celebrate because this child of mine who was lost has been found. And it's time to celebrate. So if there's anybody here today, this morning, as the worship team comes up, I'd love to pray with you. I'd love to meet you where you are right now and share a little bit more about the love and grace of our Father who loves us so much. He loves you more than the lies you've told, more than the brokenness inside of you. He loves you more than the worst things that you've done, and he's ready to put that all behind you because he's crazy about you. Let's pray.